The Navigators. Leo's soul leaned back in his seat and deeply exhaled. He slowly opened his eyes and looked down. He saw the white cuffs around his wrists. Everything around him was white, except for her. His eyes slowly rose from his wrists and met hers. She had been watching him and smirking. This is all your fault, you worthless stowie! Sol tried to raise his hands toward her, but the cuffs stopped him. The girl jumped at first, but then laughed sardonically. Her clothes were a greasy dark green along with her hair and skin. The two of them were alone, heading towards the processing center. Sol closed his eyes. He wondered how things had come to this. 2 years earlier, Sol had tested into the prestigious Beta Sector Academy. Now he was old enough to take his placement tests and find out his job on the Aegis. They were headed to a planet in the Libra constellation called Zarmina, when they had left some 200-odd years earlier. Their mission had been called the last hope for humanity, mostly by those boarding the ship. The whole ship was comprised of sectors. The inhabitants of each sector were determined by their social class. The Navigators, of course, lived in Alpha Sector. Sol had desired more than anything to see a navigator with his own eyes. It was only by their advanced calculations could the ship hope to reach its final destination. Their computational powers were phenomenal, bordering on godlike. For this reason, they were revered to the point of worship upon the ship, at least amongst the social elite. Of course, there were some fringe groups within the social outcast and rabble that still promoted the old god. Many on the ship believed that people should have been screened for any belief apart from strict atheism. Unfortunately, some of those people were allowed to come along, and humanity would continue to be plagued by their religion. Sol grabbed a handful of green nutrition cubes and caught the sky tram. The tram ride was uneventful. It was crowded, as usual, and there was a government-funded audio loop about how the renovated tram was now 89% negatron-free. There really was no difference in the tram, except it was a little slower and cost 3 extra credits to ride. "Sol, over here." It was Polaris, Sol's classmate. "Hey, Polaris, what do you think the Navigators are like?" "I heard their eyes are 100% synthetic." Polaris leaned forward in excitement. "Can you even imagine that?" The boys arrived at the academy and joined a group of other students dressed in white uniforms. After another, longer tram ride, the group arrived at the Alpha Sector. When they stepped through the doors into Alpha Sector, everyone was amazed. The synth sky was noticeably brighter and higher than their sectors. All of the buildings and streets were white. Then there were also these non-white things in the city between the buildings. They were tall pillars of brown, topped with green. Sol had heard of these trees before, but had never seen one in person. They were intricate yet powerful. It was amazing that a biologic could grow into such a thing. The trees gave Sol a strange feeling deep in his heart. Like a half-remembered dream, it was almost a homesickness, a strange longing for a place he had never been. That is when she came and ruined everything. Sol first noticed a crowd of onlookers, some from Alpha, others from his class, making a semicircle around something near a building. Closer to the center, the crowd was mostly young men, and everyone was shouting, "Don't let her get away! She must have climbed up through the garbage chutes." Sol pushed to the front to see what was happening. There was a girl, like one he had never seen before. She was blackened from a soot covering her whole body. She wore dark welding goggles, and her hair was greasy and matted down. She had a red and yellow striped scarf, the only thing on her, not soot-covered and obviously stolen. "Don't let her touch you, she'll contaminate you." "She stole that scarf, that filthy beggar!" Someone had the idea to start throwing things at her. Others joined in, and for the first time the girl looked truly scared. With one blow, her goggles were knocked off, revealing violet-colored eyes which darted about in fear. For a brief moment those eyes connected with Sol's, and he empathized with her. Sol could watch no longer. "Hold on just a second." Sol stood between the girl and the crowd. "She may be a stowaway, but she's still human. Let's stay calm until quarantine arrives. They'll know what to do." Just then 2 officers ran up through the crowd. Suddenly Saul felt a strong shove from behind, sending him flying into the quarantine officers. In another second, the girl had taken off running. "She pushed me, that ungrateful space rat," Saul thought as he sat himself up on the ground. "No good deed goes unpunished, eh?" Polaris offered Saul a hand up. Saul then went to the consortium, the home of the Navigators. Their tour guide was a young woman who told the group various facts about the Navigators. It was understood that if there was something strange or disturbing about the Navigators, it was you that were at fault for not keeping an open mind. After all, the Navigators were quintessential to space travel, and therefore the human race and you were not. The Navigators themselves were grouped in separate personal quarters that had a wide observation wall against their far ends. Tours of observers walked past them. Saul's heart skipped a beat when he saw his first Navigator. Hunched and emaciated, the Navigator ignored the onlookers. His long, balding gray hair fell as a thin drape around his head. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes were deep-set with dark circles below. Saul was distracted by a loud tap on the glass wall that separated him from the Navigators. It was Navigator Arcturus, the council leader, standing a few meters down from where Saul was. He tapped again upon the glass to attract the attention of the security guard standing against the wall. They had a brief discourse over the intercom, and during that time Arcturus pointed directly at Saul. A door slid open, and Saul was invited to come through. "Come here," Arcturus beckoned him aloofly. "Where do you hail from, boy?" "Beta sector, sir." "A good sector, Beta. They will have a crucial role on Zarmina. I have foreseen it." The Navigator paused and waited for some sort of acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir," said Saul after he realized what the Navigator was waiting for. "Have you been allocated yet?" "My final placements are 3 months out, sir. I've tested into Beta or above, but unfortunately I tested negative for the Navigator gene." "Well, we cannot all have the gene, boy. It still remains quite rare," said Arcturus, attempting reassurance but coming off as arrogant. Arcturus then knelt in front of Saul, his full-length robe spread about the ground between them. With the Navigator so close, Saul first noticed how strangely inhuman he looked. The irises of his steel-gray eyes were in constant subtle movement as he studied the boy. The Navigator's translucent skin sat upon his frail frame as it would on a man twice his age. Then Arcturus noticed the grease stain on the back of Saul's jacket, and stood up abruptly. Turning immediately on his heel, Arcturus walked away from Saul. As he left, he leaned close to the security officer and said, "He bears a lower sector contamination. There is a 43% chance of social corruption, which exceeds allowable margins. Dispose of him." Saul felt heavy hands upon his shoulders before he knew what was happening. Suddenly he heard an aerosol discharge. His muscles grew weak, and he lost consciousness. Neurogas. Saul awoke in the tram alone, handcuffed to his seat. The tram slowed to a stop, and there was a scuffle outside. The doors suddenly opened, and 2 guards came in carrying the girl Saul had seen earlier that day. They struggled her into the seat across from him amidst a flurry of biting elbows and cursing, all of which was to no avail, for she was still cuffed in place by the officers. This was how Saul had become a social outcast and criminal in under 24 hours. As Saul opened his eyes again, he looked back at the girl who was still smirking. "Galaxies, you foolish girl! Why are you smiling? Don't you know that we're in trouble?" "They forgot to take the scarf back this time." The girl was victoriously fingering the item. Then she changed the subject. "What's your name, Highgild?" "My friends call me Cassie, but you can call me Cassiopeia," she said with an air of superiority. "My name is Leo Saul. I won't tell you what my friends call me, since we aren't likely to cross that bridge," said Saul indignantly. Then added, "Wait, what do you mean this time you've escaped from quarantine before?" "That's right, Highgild, and I plan on doing it again." But you're not supposed to do that. It's against the rules." "That's just like a stowie to think that the rules don't apply to them. There's a reason why things are done a particular way, a reason why the Navigators set things up the way they did. We have to trust them." "If you had just followed the rules and stayed in your sector, neither of us would be in this mess right now," said Saul in a harsh whisper. "I have no intention of following any rule that involves me getting vaporized," said Cassie. But I could give a black hole what you decide to do. Vaporized? Repeated Saul in a stutter. What did you think they were going to do with us rebel scum? Give us a slap on the wrists? No, sir, it's the death pods for us. But I'm not a rebel. That's you, you ill-behaved monster, said Sewell. You know, you are so right. Come on, let's call the guards in and tell them. Don't worry, I'll vouch for you. A mocking smile spread across Cassie's face. I'm doomed, Saul squeaked out as his chest fell, feeling despondent. While in a haze, Saul was interned when they reached the center. He found himself in a temporary holding cell adjacent to Cassie's. Stressed and wearied from the day, Saul drifted to sleep as he wondered what tomorrow would hold. Saul's face stung inexplicably in the darkness. As he regained his bearings, he saw Cassiopeia looking down at him. You escaped! Another slap across his face. Then she covered his mouth with her hand and hissed, That's right, High Guild, I escaped, and I plan on staying escaped, so keep quiet for Galaxy's sake. Get up slowly and follow me. She led Saul to a kicked-out panel under his bed. You know, if you come with me, it means I own you. Since I saved your life, you owe me a life debt. Wait, what? No. Fine, suit yourself. Cassie lifted the vent to cover her tracks. No, wait, I'll do whatever you say. Just get me out of here. Swear it. Fine, I swear. Till kingdom come? What does that even mean? Asked Sewell. Don't tell me you're going to bring up the old god at a time like this. Are you coming or not? Cassie said impatiently. Okay, till kingdom come, all right, said Sewell, but thought, Aha, it's not like it means anything to me anyway. The space between the walls was narrow and filled with the inner workings of the ship. The drop below them disappeared into darkness between the two ledges which they straddled. They finally reached a latch covered in graffiti. When Saul went through, he found himself on a metal gangway amongst many steam pipes. The area was dimly lit, and there were other people down there going about their business. They were covered in soot like Cassie. What do we have here? Asked a man who stood in their path. He had a beard and a hard hat and was wearing a jumpsuit. Saul stepped forward. My name is Leo Sewell from Beta Sector, and I would like to lodge an official complaint. This girl hijacked my life. I just need help getting back home. I can assure you that you will be handsomely rewarded for helping me. Please bring me to the nearest authority with lift privileges and detain this criminal. I intend to prosecute her to the fullest extent of the law. The man just looked at Cassiopeia, perplexed. Oh, him. He's just a high guilder that I saved from the vaporizer. He's mine by life debt, said Cassiopeia. Good luck, Cassie. He seems like a handful. Come along, Leo, dear. Nobody likes an uppity thrall, and gave him a push forward. Cassie then brought Saul to a bazaar of sorts. It was an old shuttle bay, but the shuttles had long since been scrapped for parts. There were tents spread about of different colors, and people calling their wares. What are you going to do with me? Asked Saul, concerned. Not sure yet. Probably sell you to old Rigel for some food credits. It's not like I can afford to keep a slave. How can there be slavery on the Aegis of all places in this day and age? That's the sort of thing that we left back on Earth. Typical high guilder attitude. Everything is all solar projections and purified air on the upper decks. The reality of survival is much harsher than you want to admit. All of the wickedness, bigotry, and hatred of the old world came with us, because people came on the Aegis, and human nature is always the same. A man might change, but men never do. So why fight it? Alpha Sector subjugates the lower sectors. One man does it to another man. What's the difference? I say, there is none, said Cassiopeia coldly. As they moved through the bazaar, Saul noticed that a man had begun following them. He was tall and broad-shouldered. His head was wrapped in a white linen cloth, except for his blue eyes. A few feet before they reached old Rigel's tent, the stranger cut in front of them. Hey, Cassie, who's that straight-laced fella you got there? Asked the stranger. What business is it of yours? Cassie addressed him peevishly. Easy squirt, I was just curious is all. No need to get hot under the collar. The spacer took a few steps back and held his hands up in defense. Pixis Asterion. The spacer thrust his hand into Saul's. He was the first person who addressed Saul directly since he got there. How you doing, boss? Look, would you get out of my way? I mean to sell this high guild to Rigel, said Cassie. Oh, why'd you want to go and do a thing like that? He looks too green to have learned a skill yet. Seems to me you got yourself a dud. Pixis pulled his face through its linen wrapping and flashed a smile. Like I said before, what business of that is yours? Cassie said, frustrated. Settle down, Squirt. All I'm saying is maybe I'd like to buy him. What do you figure he's worth? Maybe 120 or so credits. Not that you could afford it. You're a spacer. You don't even have a guild. You're exiles and beggars forced to live off ship. I doubt there's 120 credits among the lot of you, said Cassie. Shows what you know. I got more credits than that right here. Probably stolen, mumbled Cassie, loud enough for Pixis to hear. Do you want them or not? A credit's a credit, I guess. Cassie shrugged and took the credits. What are you planning on doing with him? Well, Squirt, to quote someone I heard recently, what business of that is yours? Pixis gave a half-smile and handed her the credits. Fine, have it your way, said Cassie abruptly. All right, boss, we don't have all day, said the spacer to Saul as he led him away from Cassie. What are you going to do with me? Saul asked Pixis nervously. Well, you see, boss, I'm pretty low on the totem pole around here. It's not going to make me feel any better shoving someone below me. I plan on setting you free. You can do what you want. What if I want to go back to Beta Sector? You're welcome to try, kid. But from what I know of the Navigators, they don't take kindly to being told they're wrong. How do you think they'd react to you showing up again and mucking up their plans? Saul froze in place for a few seconds, thinking about it, then grew very pale. The spacer had continued walking away. When Saul snapped back to reality, he ran to catch up with him. That's what I thought, boss. Look, I know it'll be tough not seeing your family again, but don't worry about that. The administration decided biological family units were inefficient. I haven't seen them in 2 years. Well, I suppose you could tag along with me, kid, if you aren't otherwise predisposed. Pixis led Saul to the far wall of the hangar near the airlock. There were a few more spacers hanging around who greeted Pixis amicably. They were all dressed in spacesuits. Pixis dug through a small pack and handed Saul an extra suit. Once Saul was dressed, he asked, Where are we going? We're going on a little walk. I'd like to make it home by a reasonable hour. I've got a busy day tomorrow. No doubt picking through garbage and begging for food, mumbled Saul rudely. Look, kid, what do you think spacefarers do exactly? Nothing. Just like Cassie said, I learned about them in school. You're the only group that lost their guild status when you challenged the Navigators. You just hang on the outside of the ship, living off charity the other guilds offer you. Kid, you're in for a surprise. Pixis clipped the two's safety lines and blew the airlock. Instantly, the air rushed out the open door. Saul screamed. After the air left, they began to slide across the wall of the airlock towards the outer door. Saul finally looked over his shoulder into open space when they had stopped moving. This was the first time he had seen it in his life. Great space! Saul gasped through an overly slacked jaw. What gives, boss? You act like you've never seen space before. I never have. On the upper decks, all of the blast screens are kept down to keep out the negatrons. Oh, black holes, the negatrons. We have to cover ourselves before it's too late. Saul thrust his arms up, trying to shield his eyes. What in heaven and earth is a negatron? These particles that come through open space. They cause attention deficits, emotional imbalances, and potential weight gain, explained Saul. Huh, so that's their game, is it? Pixis shrugged. Relax, kid. I've been out here every day of my life. There's no such thing as a negatron. Saul lowered his arms. What are we doing out here? We're waiting for my jumper, boss. Why don't you take in the view or something? The ship rotated slowly as open space rolled out before them. The sky was speckled with twinkling stars. The Aegis was drifting above a gas giant. The clouds swirled and raged below. As Saul looked at the sky, he felt the majesty and scale of it all was terrifying, but the beauty was captivating and exhilarating. He dared not look away. In that moment, Saul felt the idea of the old god wasn't as far-fetched as he used to believe. Through the infinity of space, a small ship came skipping through. Here's our ride, boss, said Pixis, slapping the ship on the side. So, boss, what's the word in the tin can on why the Spacing Guild was exiled? The Spacers rebelled and tried to set up a dictatorship under the old captain, but failed. The Navigators took control of the autopilot, eliminating the need for Spacers entirely. They don't need to see the outside. They plot the ship's jump coordinates based on mathematics and dead reckoning. They say a few of you are still sticking to the ship like parasites, but most of you have long since died out. Huh. Is that so, boss? Asked Pixis. Well, that's news to me. Look, kid, you got the spiel about the Spacing Guild and the captain, right? But that's about the only thing. About 200 or so years back, someone in the ivory tower gets the notion that we're getting overpopulated, at least with the wrong types of people, see? And since we're going to be drifting through open space for a good amount of time, what's the use of a Spacing Guild? After all, there's another little hiccup that they had to deal with. Us Spacers tended to believe in what they called the Old God, which posed a serious roadblock to the direction decent society was heading. As they spoke, the transport moved towards the front of the ship. They stopped at the old captain's deck, which was now populated by Spacers and their families. What do you think, boss? This is where the magic happens. Some magic. You just commandeered a useless helm. The ship is on autopilot, remember? Autopilot? You are thick, aren't you, boss? That autopilot doohickey has been out of commission since we swapped out the engines. You swapped out the engines? Sol repeated in near horror. You're saying the Aegis is rocketing through space on just some guesstimations of a bunch of Spacer deadbeats? We're doomed! Look, I'll shoot straight with you, kid. About 7 or 8 years after your eggheads gave us Spacers the boot, these cats from Earth came by, selling intergalactic engines. Well, it just so happened that we were in the market for such an engine. Imagine that, right? After it was hooked up, we were able to reach Zarmina in months, but they didn't work with the autopilot, so we turned it off, the Spacer said. Who handles all the calculations if you don't have autopilot? The way this usually works, boss, is that a few Spacers in those little shuttles you see floating around make a hyper jump to where we want to go. Then once they jump back and tell us everything is safe, we move the old garbage scow to the area the shuttles have cleared. But that means you're just sitting here waiting between jumps. With the Navigator's plan, we're able to plot each jump while moving at near light speed. It's more efficient. More efficient, my space boot! Sometimes, when I'm bored, I like to plug some of your Navigator's course corrections into the computer for a laugh. The last one would have steered us right into a black hole. When it comes down to my life, I don't care what some egghead, navigator, guru, or prophet on that ship thinks he knows. I'll put my money on someone who's been to where I want to be and came back to show me the way. If we reached Zarmina, then how come no one on the ship knows about it? How come no one told us? I think a few poor saps tried the first go-round, but they were vaporized for their trouble. The eggheads called it something like a Spacer subversion attempt, Pixis said, so we figured we'd just float around with everyone and wait it out. I still don't see how any of you Spacers could navigate anywhere. You're barely educated enough to string a few proper sentences together. Sol looked down his nose at the Spacer with a self-righteous smirk. What do you mean, uneducated? For your information, I speak perfect galactic standard. I hate to break it to you, boss, but everyone in the galaxy except for you stiffs in the tin can speaks this way. But my sincerest apologies if I do offend thee, my liege, said the Spacer with a sardonic bow. If the galaxy is full of more people like you, frankly, it's a wonder it gets anything done at all. Awfully nice words for the guy who saved your life. About that, Spacer. Pixis. About that, Pixis, not to put too fine of a point on it. But why did you save me anyway? It didn't seem like there was a shortage of other people that needed rescuing down in the shuttle bay. Ah, you picked up on that, huh? Maybe you're not as dumb as you look. It's your clothes. They're still pretty much white. That's important. My clothes? That doesn't make sense. Sure it does. Have you seen most of the guys down there on the lower tier? They look like they fell face first into a Rorschach test. But why do I need clean clothes? 'Cause we're sending you back. Sending me back? Why? I came with you because you said the Navigators would vaporize me if I went back. Now you want to send me back. Why would I even go? Because if you don't, everyone on the Aegis is going to die. What? Why? Because one of the reactors near Alpha Sector is going to blow. Ha! I knew it, you idiots swapped out the engines without thinking about the consequences, and now everyone is going to pay. Classic evidence of spacers' inability to govern themselves. Gee, that's funny, boss. Last time I checked, it was one of your internal reactors. Of course, with your foot in your mouth, like that, I'd assume it might be hard to see. If it's an internal reactor, how come you know so much about it? Well, believe it or not, while you and the geniuses in there were playing My Little Dictatorship, the rest of the world came up with some pretty nifty advances. Like the ability to scan reactors remotely, for example. Well then, what's wrong with it? Apparently there's some big, useless filter on the front doing God knows what, putting the kibosh on the whole system. I give it 2 months before it overloads, and then, kablooey! The spacer expanded his hands in an explosion in front of Saul. Saul looked at the screen with the reactor on it. But that's the negatron filter. Priceless. There's high guild logic for you. Blow yourself up because of something that doesn't exist. So what does this all have to do with me? So nice of you to ask, boss. We were hoping you might be willing to go back and convince people in there to stop doing something that's going to kill all of us. You want me to convince people to stop believing in negatrons? Well, the spacer sucked air through his back teeth and laid a heavy glance on Saul. That's impossible. Everyone believes in negatrons, Saul insisted. Ah, come on, boss. They've got to believe you. It's for their own good. Saul crossed his arms. How about this? Pixis stomped his foot in exclamation. Tell them everything. Tell them there's a bigger world than their little city. Tell them the world is brighter and better than they could imagine. And we're up here looking out for them, trying to keep them safe. Tell them that they got their heads screwed on backwards and their way might seem right, but it's going to kill them. Uh-huh. And when I tell them that, why exactly are they going to believe me? After all you've sent others before, I don't see why things are going to go any better for me. Well, what if... what if you take something, some advanced tech that doesn't exist in there yet? Something that they couldn't duplicate, like as proof or something. You know, that could actually work, if we'd do it correctly. Saul rubbed his chin. Well, I'll keep an eye on you from up here, kid. You give me some sign and I'll stop the ship short. Then, presto, instant earthquake. Pixis led Saul to something that looked like an escape pod near the captain's deck. What is this? Asked Saul. It's a pneumatic pod. It will get you over to Alpha Sector in no time. Pixis pulled back on a lever and the pod opened for Saul to climb in. As he did so, Saul noticed that Pixis had a half-smile and a far-off look on his face. What's wrong with you? Who, me? Nothing. Except, well, there was a guy who's pretty important to those of us that believe in the old god. He had to do something similar, sorta, like you, I mean. He snuck into hostile territory to warn a group of people that refused to listen to him about something that could save their life. He convinced some of them to believe him by doing things that no one else could do, but there were still a lot who wouldn't listen. Well, how'd it turn out for him? Things worked out well for him in the end, even if he did have to get through a rough patch first. What do you mean, rough patch? Right, well, forget about him. I'll tell you later. I'm sure folks will be much more willing to listen to you. Good luck, boss. Pixis pulled down the lever, and the pod went rocketing towards the center of the ship.